All right, so let's dive into this Brunson case that seems to be on everyone's mind. We've got a whole stack of articles here, Newsweek, American Media Group, even the WLT report. It seems like they're all buzzing about this Supreme Court case.
Yeah, and what's really interesting to me is how this case, brought by these Brunson brothers, has really become this focal point for all these anxieties people have about the 2020 election. It's not just some legal battle, It feels like it reflects something much deeper going on in society.
And it's hard to ignore how much 2020 is still in the air. I guess for anyone who hasn't been glued to this case, the Brunson brothers are basically saying that hundreds of federal officials, even some big names, totally dropped the ball on investigating claims of election fraud back in 2020.
Right, and their claim is that this supposed inaction was like a direct violation of their oaths of office, which is, pretty bold legally speaking. It's like they're saying you swore to uphold the Constitution and you didn't, not by investigating. And the media coverage, oh man, it's been a wild ride. Outlets like AMG News are really playing this up as like a game changer, suggesting it could even overturn the 2020 election results.
Yeah, their article even throws in the military and Space Force, suggesting they've got some kind of evidence of election fraud.
Which, kind of shows how this whole thing's gotten tangled up with a bunch of conspiracy theories. Got to be careful with those, right? Skepticism is healthy.
For sure. Newsweek, though, they take a totally different approach, right? They focus on the fact that 3 Supreme Court justices recused themselves from the case. They were named as defendants in a separate lawsuit filed by one of the Brunson brothers. That's not something you see every day, is it?
No, not at all.
Sure.
It speaks to how unconventional this whole legal battle is. These Brunson brothers, they're not lawyers. They're just regular people who took on this huge legal fight themselves.
Total David versus Goliath situation. But they've definitely got people's attention, especially those who are concerned about election integrity.
Right. Yeah, and that's what makes this case so significant. Even if their arguments don't ultimately win out, it shows a really deep distrust in this system, a feeling that something was wrong back in 2020.
So let's rewind a bit. They first filed their lawsuits in lower courts and got shut down. Appealed to the 10th Circuit and...
hit a wall. The court said they didn't have legal standing.
Okay, standing. I've heard that term before, but legally speaking, I'm not sure I get it.
Sure. So standing basically means you've got skin in the game, you've got to show that you were personally harmed by whatever the officials did, even if you think fraud happened.
So they couldn't just sue based on principle.
Exactly. Had to be directly affected.
Gotcha.
3 justices bail out because they were named as defendants in another lawsuit from one of the Brunsons.
Which claimed
that the justices, by denying an earlier request for the Supreme Court to review a related case, violated their oaths. That request, by the way, is what's called a petition for a writ of certiorari.
Okay, writ of. I'm going to need a bit more on that one.
It's basically a fancy way of asking the Supreme Court to review a lower court's decision. Like, hey, Supreme Court, take a look at this. That's how cases climb the ladder to the highest court.
Gotcha. So the Brunsons were saying these justices didn't do their sworn duty by rejecting their first request, and because of that, those justices stepped aside.
Yeah, it's all about keeping things impartial, avoiding any conflicts of interest, especially when their actions in a past case are being directly challenged.
Okay, that makes sense. What were some of the big points they argued in court?
The Brunsons, again, hammered on the idea that the officials didn't do their sworn duty by not investigating the fraud claims. They said it was a betrayal, they didn't uphold the Constitution, didn't protect how elections work.
So their argument is that taking the oath means you have to investigate any claim that could mess with an election. But is there actually some rule that says officials have to investigate every single fraud claim?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And it gets to the heart of all the legal nitty-gritty in this case. Remember, a bunch of legal challenges to the 2020 election have already been thrown out because there wasn't enough evidence.
So just yelling fraud isn't enough. You need some real proof.
Exactly. And that's where things get tricky for the Brunsons. Their arguments are based on this idea that there was tons of fraud, even though that hasn't really been proven in court.
So they're already fighting an uphill battle. They've got to prove that the officials should have investigated and that there was real evidence of fraud to back that up.
And on top of that, they also need to prove that the officials knew they should investigate and chose not to. Remember, they're not just saying the officials messed up. They're saying they deliberately broke their oaths.
Okay, so the bar is high for them.
It will. This isn't just some legal case, It's a snapshot of how divided and anxious we are as a country.
Yeah, especially with another election looming. 2020 definitely hasn't faded away.
Absolutely. This case has tapped into something raw in American politics, and whatever the court decides is going to have a ripple effect way beyond the courtroom.
Okay, so let's dig into those ripple effects. What could this case mean for the legal system, but also for the whole political scene?
Well, legally speaking, the court's decision could totally change how we understand and enforce oaths of office. If they side with the Brunsons, it could mean a flood of lawsuits against any official who's seen as not upholding their oath.
And that could change how officials work and what we expect of them.
Totally. Politically, though, things could get even more heated around election integrity. If the Brunsons win, it might convince people that the 2020 election was rigged, even though their case isn't directly about that. But if they lose, it could make people think the system is rigged against anyone who questions the results.
So no matter what happens, it seems like things could get even more divided.
It's a possibility. This case really shows how fragile our democracy is and how easily distrust and division can weaken it.
And how important it is to have these tough conversations, try to understand the issues, and find real, accurate information, even when it's uncomfortable.
Totally agree. The Brunson case is a wake-up call. We can't take our democracy for granted. We got to be informed, engaged, and pay attention if we want to keep it strong.
All right, so we've talked about the legal stuff, the political fallout. But let's take a second to talk about the human side of this. These are real people, the Brunson brothers, who believe they're doing the right thing. What can we learn from their story, even if we don't agree with everything they're saying?
That's a good point. This is ultimately a story about belief, about conviction, about fighting for what you think is right. The Brunson brothers, even without being legal experts, were driven by this powerful feeling that something was wrong and had to be challenged.
It's that they had to act on their conscience, even though the odds were against them.
Exactly. And I think there's something admirable about that, whatever your political views. It shows the power of individual action, of standing up for what you believe in, even when it's tough or unpopular.
So this is more than just a legal case. It's about the courage to challenge the status quo, sticking to your beliefs, and showing that everyday people can make their voices heard. And that's a powerful message, whatever the outcome of their case.
I agree. It's a reminder that we all have a responsibility in shaping our democracy. And it all starts with being informed, engaged, and ready to have these tough conversations.
Well said. Now, we've talked about the Brunson brothers, their legal battles, and all the tangled issues their cases brought up. But their story has also kicked up a media storm. Outlets everywhere are interpreting and spinning things their own way.
It's kind of wild, right? We've got Newsweek, American Media Group, the WLT Report, each with our own take on the Brunson case. It shows how the same facts can be twisted in different directions depending on who's telling the story and who they're talking to.
So it's not just about the facts themselves, it's about how they're packaged and presented.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to be a smart newsreader, especially when it comes to something as sensitive and controversial as elections.
Okay, so let's dive into these different perspectives. We'll start with Newsweek. They take a pretty analytical approach, right? Focusing on the legal details and the unusual recusals of those Supreme Court justices. What do you make of their coverage?
I think Newsweek does a good job of setting the scene and explaining the legal stuff in a way that's easy to understand, even if you're not a lawyer. They don't try to make it a spectacle. They stick to the facts, which is kind of rare these days. They also point out how unusual this whole case is, especially those recusals. It shows how much this case is shaking things up, even in the legal world.
Okay, so Newsweek is playing it straight, giving a balanced view. What about American Media Group, AMG News? Their coverage seems much more amped up, right? More emotion.
Oh yeah, they're definitely going for the dramatic angle. Big headlines, strong claims, even hinting that the military and Space Force are involved in uncovering election fraud. It's attention-grabbing, but gotta remember, these are just claims. Nothing's been proven in court.
It's like a reminder to always check your sources,
Yeah,
right?
or-
Not all news is created equal.
Definitely.
What about the WLT report? They seem to be somewhere in between.
Yeah, they go into more detail about the Brunson brothers' legal journey, their motivations, why they're making these claims. They also explore what could happen if the case goes one way or the other, even suggesting that it could trigger a constitutional crisis.
Whoa, that's a heavy prediction. Do you think they're onto something?
I mean, it's just one way of looking at things. The WLT report has done its research, and their analysis is interesting. But we should always consider other viewpoints, right? Not jump to conclusions.
So it's all about looking at things from different angles and forming our own opinions based on what we learn.
Exactly. The Brunson case is complicated. There are no easy answers, no clear-cut good guys and bad guys. It's about the challenges we face as a nation in a world where we're constantly bombarded with different, sometimes conflicting information. And I think that's what makes it so fascinating and so important to understand.
It's wild, isn't it, how differently the media is handling this. Like AMG News, they're all about the drama, making the Brunsons out to be heroes, taking on this corrupt system. Like they've got some big secret.
Okay, but couldn't you say they're just reflecting what a lot of people actually think? I mean, this case has struck a chord with those who feel ignored, right? Those who think no one's listening to their concerns.
That's fair. Concerns about elections, about whether they're fair, that's important. We can't just brush that aside. But got to be careful, right?
So how do we tell the difference? When there's so much noise, so many different stories, how do we sort through it all? That's where media literacy comes in. Got to be smart about what we read, who we trust, check the facts, be aware of bias. But again, multiple perspectives, right? Can't just accept one version as the gospel truth.
So WLT report, kind of in the middle, more detail than AMG News, but also more interpretation than Newsweek.
Exactly. And that's a good rule of thumb for anything you read. Be skeptical, question things. Don't just buy into whatever's being served up, especially when it comes to complex, heated topics like elections.
Okay, so we've got the media landscape, but zoom out for a second. This case has become more than just a legal fight. It's a symbol, right, for a lot of anxieties people have about democracy itself.
Yeah, it's like a lightning rod for all these fears and frustrations people are feeling.
Like what?
Distrust in institutions, the feeling that the game is rigged, that elections aren't fair anymore. These feelings have been brewing for years, fueled by partisan fighting, economic inequality, and all this misinformation flying around.
And the Brunson case has given those feelings a name, a face.
Exactly. It fits the narrative for those who think something was off in 2020, even if they can't pinpoint what it was. It's a symbol for those who feel ignored, unheard, like their vote doesn't count.
And social media, alternative news, that's played a big role in spreading this story, right?
Huge. Social media has amplified their story, connected them to people who share their concerns, but it's also created these echo chambers where those feelings get stronger.
So this started in a courtroom, but it's become a cultural phenomenon, driven by social media, alternative news, and this underlying unease about democracy itself.
That's the heart of it. It's not just a legal case. It's about this moment in history, about the cultural and political landscape. And that's why it's so crucial to understand.
Okay, so we've talked about the media frenzy, the anxieties this case has tapped into. Let's circle back to the actual legal stuff for a sec. What are the Brunsons claiming, and what's their reasoning?
Their main argument is that all these officials, hundreds of them, broke their oaths of office by not investigating claims of election fraud before they certified the 2020 results. They're saying this was a betrayal, that these officials failed to uphold the Constitution to protect the election process.
So they're saying these officials had to investigate every single claim, no matter what, even if there wasn't much evidence.
That's their argument. And they're saying that by not doing that, these officials basically helped undermine the election. It's a bold claim, and it raises questions about what an oath really means, the limits of power, and the role of conscience in government.
Okay, let's break that down. First, oaths of office. They're symbolic, right? A formality. Do they actually have legal weight?
More than you might think. Oaths are legally binding. Officials are promising to uphold the Constitution, to do their jobs honestly. It's the foundation of the rule of law, of public trust in government.
So breaking your oath has consequences.
It can. Depends on what happened, what office they hold. But there are ways to hold them accountable.
Okay, so oaths matter. But what about the limits of power? The Brunsons say officials had to investigate every little thing. Is that realistic?
Tricky question. Officials are responsible for fair elections, but they also have to operate within the law, respect due process. Investigating every single claim would be impossible.
So there's a balance to be struck. Protect elections, but do it fairly legally.
Exactly. And that's where it gets murky. There's no simple rule book. It's about judgment, using discretion, looking at the evidence carefully.
And that brings us to conscience, right? The Brunsons are basically saying that sometimes officials have to go beyond the rules, follow their gut, even if it means challenging the system.
That's their point. And it's a powerful one, especially when something as important as elections is at stake. But it's a slippery slope. Who gets to decide when it's okay to bend the rules? What stops people from abusing that power?
Yeah, tough questions. And that's what makes this case so interesting, so unsettling. It forces us to think about the legal system, about power, about what happens when personal beliefs clash with how things are supposed to work.
And it reminds us that the system isn't perfect. It can be manipulated, abused, or even just make honest mistakes.
Okay, so the court's decision is going to be a big deal no matter what. But let's step back even further. What does this whole Brunson saga tell us about democracy in our times? About how we handle information, how we find truth when it feels like everything's up for grabs?
That's a big one. I think the Brunson case is a wake-up call. It shows how fragile our democracy is, how much distrust we have in our institutions, and how quick people are to believe things that fit their worldview. And that's really dangerous for democracy. You can't have a functioning democracy if people can't agree on basic facts, if they can't have honest debates based on those facts.
So if we're in this mess, is there a way out? Can we rebuild trust? Can we bridge the divides?
Yeah.
Can we get back to a place where people are informed and engaged?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's not going to be easy. But I think there's hope. We have to start with education. Give people the tools to think critically, to spot fake news, to evaluate sources, to be careful about what they see online.
So it's about empowering people to be smarter about the information they consume,
Yeah.
to question things, to look for different perspectives.
Exactly. And we need to cultivate curiosity, open-mindedness, a little humility, be willing to listen to people who disagree with us, to challenge our own beliefs, to accept that we don't know everything.
That's tough, though, isn't it? Especially these days when we're drowning in information and it's so easy to just stick to our own little bubbles, our own echo chambers.
It is tough, but it's crucial if we want a better future.
Well said. Okay, so we've talked about education, critical thinking, being open-minded. What about the institutions themselves? Government, the courts, the media, can they do anything to rebuild trust and help us find a shared reality?
They have a huge responsibility. They need to be more transparent, more accountable, more focused on the people they're supposed to serve. And they need to do more to promote truth and accuracy.
So it's about walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
Exactly. And it takes trust on both sides. Institutions have to trust the people, and people have to believe that institutions are working for them, not against them.
Okay, so rebuilding trust is a two-way street. It takes effort from everyone, from institutions and individuals. It's about transparency, about being accountable, about working together for the common good.
You got it. The Brunson case, it's exposed some serious cracks in our foundation, but it's also a chance to fix those cracks, to build something stronger, more resilient.
Well said. Well, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the Brunson case. It's been a wild ride, a little scary at times, but it's definitely given us a lot to think about. To all our listeners out there, as you process all this, remember to stay curious, be critical, and get involved. Because in a democracy, we all have a responsibility to shape our future. And that's it for this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring.